Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Plain Bagel. I'm your host, Richard Coffin. Obviously, by now, we've all seen the headlines, right? About how the transitory inflation rates of the pandemic are proving a bit less transitory than central bankers probably hoped for. Thanks to continuing supply chain constraints and the monetary stimulus from the pandemic, we're now seeing consumer prices jump quite a bit. In January, the latest figure at the time of recording, we saw the consumer price index jump 7.5% year over year in the United States. And obviously this is nerve-wracking for a lot of people, given that every time we're seeing inflation figures, they're coming out higher and higher. It makes a lot of people nervous. This is people's livelihood, their wealth that they're seeing deteriorated by these inflation rates. But while this isn't to diminish the real pain that some people are experiencing in North America thanks to rising consumer prices, it is worth mentioning that when we talk about inflation, we certainly aren't the hardest being hit from this phenomenon. And you can't really talk about inflation without bringing up our neighbors from across the ocean, the country of Turkey. You might have heard that in January of 2022, Turkey, which is actually one of the top 20 largest economies in the world, saw an inflation pace of 11.1%. Now you might think, Richard, that doesn't sound too bad. Sure, it is above what we're seeing here in North America, but not too far off. Until you realize that that is the month-over-month inflation pace. How much prices jumped in just 31 days. The annual inflation pace was 48.7%, a 20-year high for the figure. In fact, since 2011, the value of the Turkish lira against the US dollar has lost 90% of its value. And the issue has caused a lot of other problems in the economy. Youth unemployment has been above 20% over the past couple of years. We're seeing both capital and human capital flight from the country as people seek shelter from these high inflation rates. And we're even seeing retailers hoard their inventory rather than selling it because they're worried they won't be able to eventually afford to remanufacture the thing they're trying to sell. So you can see that this eye-watering inflation rate is having pretty devastating consequences for the economy of Turkey. But possibly more mind-boggling than the actual pace of inflation is one of the key reasons behind why it's happening. And that's effectively that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the country's president, doesn't understand economics. Even though there are different schools of economic thought, most people can agree that interest rates tend to have a negative or inverse relationship with inflation. So as inflation rates start to rise, most central bankers look to increase interest rates to offset that, to cool things down. That's why we're seeing in the news that rate hikes are expected here in North America and in Europe as central bankers look to tackle the rising inflation rates. But Turkey is doing the exact opposite of that. Despite inflation rates quickly accelerating to pretty destructive levels, the central bank has continued cutting its interest rate under the orders of the president, with the rate being cut by 5 percentage points over the past year, which has caused many issues in the country of Turkey. Which is why I wanted to cover this. As we're talking about inflation in North America, I think it's important to shine a spotlight on the situation unfolding in the Middle East, because I don't think it gets all that much attention in the news, and quite frankly, it is a unique story that has a lot of lessons to be learned. So I'll be taking some time to explain some of the economic theory behind inflation and interest rates, why Turkey is doing what it's currently doing, and what the implications have been for that country. And please, I want to make it very clear that this is not a criticism of the country of Turkey or the people who live in Turkey, but it is to analyze that situation so that we can learn from the mistakes that have been made and hopefully avoid it from happening in the future. So let's start at a high level by explaining why economists believe that interest rates have a negative relationship with inflation. This video will be divided into chapters, so if you're already familiar with this theory, if you will, you can skip ahead to the next section. But I do want to cover the basics so that everyone's kind of on a level playing field for understanding the story at hand. So interest rates obviously refer to the cost of borrowing money, the amount that you pay to banks or whoever when you borrow money from them. In inflation in this situation, we're talking about the rising consumer prices, or the phenomenon of too much money chasing too few goods. Obviously, some people define inflation as just being money supply. That plays a role here with too much money, but it's not the only factor worth considering in this situation. Now, holding all else constant, inflation and interest rates tend to have a negative relationship. As interest rates go up, it tends to apply downwards pressure on inflation rates, and as interest rates go down, it tends to apply upwards pressure onto inflation rates. And one of the main reasons for that is that lower interest rates makes it cheaper to borrow money and less effective to save your money. And that tends to have an inflationary pressure because you have more demand for, if you're holding all else constant, the same number of goods. That increases the likelihood that suppliers will increase their prices. And there's also a more kind of complicated factor at play here, which is that lower interest rates actually tend to increase money supply. Now, this is a very much oversimplified explanation, But essentially, when you have lower interest rates, it encourages lending activity, and the more loans that are made, the higher money supply increases. Loans play a very important role with total money supply. That could be a topic of its own, and perhaps that's something I'll tackle in the future. But just to summarize, as more people lend money, the actual money supply in an economy increases. And again, if you have more money chasing the same or lower number of goods, you're going to see inflationary pressures. So that's the reason most economists believe that interest rates have an inverse relationship with inflation, and why many central bankers around the world will look to increase interest rates when they're battling high inflation rates. Now, when it comes to inflation in Turkey, it's not really a new issue. Turkey actually has quite the history of battling high inflation rates. They've seen historical rates much higher than what they're currently experiencing. But in the 2000s, the country went through a number of reforms to rejuvenate their economy and add some semblance of stability to the country. And they were largely effective. It included introducing the new Turkish lira, which was a denomination of the older one. And importantly, the central bank was made independent of the government. Now, the reason this is important for a developed economy is that central banks, their sole objective should be to ensure the stability of a currency within a country. There are some secondary objectives usually at play, but that tends to be the core or the most important focus, is to ensure that the currency that a country uses stays usable, effectively. Now, these reforms did manage to wrangle inflation down into the single-digit range, but even before the pandemic, it was starting to heat up again, largely due to political instability once again, and Erdogan spooking foreign investors by communicating that he wanted to intervene to keep interest rates low. But while there was some early austerity to help fight this inflation, this proved pretty unpopular for the president, and he since turned to cutting interest rates to boost economic activity. In fact, when the chief of the central bank resisted his pressure to lower interest rates further in 2019, Erdogan fired him and was the first of 3 central bank governors to be replaced by the president for not bending to his demand. Which brings us to the question of why Turkey is doing this. Why are rates being cut when inflation is already running out of control? Well, to oversimplify it, it essentially comes down to the belief that lowering interest rates will bolster activity in the economy by such a degree that the country will effectively grow its way out of inflation. If we define inflation as too much money chasing too few goods, well, if you increase the number of goods in the economy that are being produced and whatnot, then you might actually be able to lower inflationary pressures. And Erdogan has been quoted saying that he believes it will increase spending, investing, and hiring within the country of Turkey as more money becomes available. Erdogan also has the belief that as inflation rates rise and the Turkish lira becomes less and less valuable, it will actually make Turkish goods cheaper for foreign buyers. And there is some truth to that. It's what economists call an automatic stabilizer. As a country's currency becomes less and less valuable, it does make the prices of that good relative to other currencies cheaper because those currencies can buy more of that Turkish lira and thereby buy more Turkish goods. And it's something we have seen other countries utilize in the past to try and boost their own export activity. We recently saw China devalue its own currency in an attempt to boost their export activity. But outside these economic beliefs, there is a chance that some of Erdogan's motivation here is more philosophical or religious in nature than for economic purposes. Because Erdogan has actually been quoted as saying that interest rates are the mother and father of all evil. You see, Erdogan appears to subscribe to some of the values of Islamic finance, which, if you aren't aware, views lending and loan activity as being usurpation, the unjust taking of property. Now, obviously, the economy still has lending and interest rates, but that might explain part of the reason why Erdogan has this vendetta against interest rates, which he has been quoted saying is an evil that makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. Now, even though not all these justifications are totally unmerited or, out of the ballpark, there are some key reasons why we're clearly still seeing a net negative impact on the economy from lower interest rates and these high inflation rates. With the first one being that the country has long maintained a current account deficit. Now, all that means is that the country has long been a net importer of goods. They import more goods from foreign countries than they export to foreign buyers. In fact, in January, the country had a current account deficit of $3.841 billion US dollars. And in the year 2020, this account deficit represented 5% of their annual GDP. So it's a sizable chunk of their economy relies on these net imports. And the problem is that when you're a net importer with high inflation rates, those net imports become more expensive. As we said, exports get less expensive for foreign buyers, but as you try to buy more stuff with your less and less valuable currency from foreigners, it becomes more and more expensive to do so. And because Turkey specifically is a net importer of oil, that obviously has had big ramifications for much of the economy. Oil is a very important commodity for economies and has increased sharply in price thanks to the pandemic, which really increases the pain that Turkey is experiencing here. Another reason this strategy has been really harmful for the economy is that Turkey has a high foreign debt balance. Many private corporations and consumers borrowed money from foreign lenders when interest rates were high domestically because foreigners typically had a lower interest rate on their debts. So it was cheaper at the time for people to borrow money from abroad. The problem is that as inflation rates increased, those debts became harder and harder to pay off. Imagine it like you had a mortgage where every year your mortgage payment doubled in price. That's effectively what a lot of these people had to deal with because their less and less valuable Turkish lira had to pay more and more to buy the same amount of foreign dollars or whatever the amount be to pay off their debt. And that's caused a lot of bankruptcies in the country, something that's worked directly against that objective of increasing economic activity. And amplifying this problem is the fact that many foreign investors have been scared off by these high inflation rates because of the lack of currency stability, which has made lending more difficult to accomplish and even more expensive for Turkish people. And finally, one of the reasons these high inflation rates are expected to be painful for Turkey is that high inflation rates tend to be sticky. There's this belief that as inflation rates rise, people come to expect higher and higher prices from the goods they buy and sell. And this expected inflation rate actually has an impact on real inflation rate. It's sort of a positive feedback loop. Because if a seller believes that next year prices for everything else will be higher, they'll likely increase the price of their goods this year to accommodate. And that in and of itself increases prices in the economy. So when you have this sort of runaway inflation, it can be very difficult to tackle as you essentially have to reset people's expectations around inflation. And when you have a president who's continually lowering interest rates, it's going to take quite a bit to reverse that trajectory. Now, with all this being said, there have been some attempts to alleviate the pain being caused by inflation rates here. For one, there was a special bank account opened where the government would compensate people for the wealth they lost thanks to inflation with a payment at the end of every year in addition to bank savings account rates. And the country has used its dollar reserves to sort of artificially increase demand for their Turkish lira to, support their exchange rates. But as reserves run dry and as the government obviously has a limited amount of money, given that the central bank is still technically independent, there are obviously issues there, and it's a finite resource for bolstering the economy. So that's the situation at hand. And to say that Erdogan is the only cause of inflation for the country would be short-sighted. There are a lot of factors and deep-rooted issues that the country has been tackling with its economy. But clearly the actions here have not been helping the situation around inflation, and in many ways have made the situation much worse for the people of Turkey. So what are the takeaways? There's no kind of happy or positive note to end on, but what are the lessons learned from this disaster? Well, firstly, the independence of a central bank is key to monetary stability within a country. We've seen that time and time again, and true independence, not just independence on paper. Secondly, it can take just one bad leader in the sense of economic policy to really undo the work of decades, if not centuries, of progress. We've seen that many times before, and you need not look further than Venezuela for a prime example of that. And finally, interest rates have a negative relationship with inflation. It's economics 101. Obviously, there are a lot of schools of thought around it. There are different understandings of the factors at play, and stuff that can be debated. But I think we've seen enough examples to demonstrate that this holds true in many situations, that any view to the opposite of this is unorthodox. Anyway, thank you for joining me today. I know it's a bit more of a serious topic, but it's an important one to go over, I think. It doesn't get a whole lot of attention here in North America. And given that we're talking about high inflation rates here in Canada, the US, and many other countries around the world, I think it's only right to talk about Turkey, a country, one of the biggest economies in the world, experiencing a much deadlier situation around their inflation. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned a bit about the situation. If I have any viewers from Turkey, I hope you're doing well, and I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts about the situation as it's unfolding. Thank you for joining me today, and yeah, as always, be safe out there.